Hi, I'm Simon Livo. I'm an evolutionary ecologist at the University of New Orleans.
Hi, I'm Jerry Husak. I'm an evolutionary physiologist at the University of St. Thomas.
Welcome to Biology Exit Interviews, where we sit down with biologists who've had long and distinguished careers to talk about their science and about how biology has changed over the course of their working lives.
And whether you're brand new to integrative biology or you've been doing it for decades, I hope you'll join us and find something interesting in our stories. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, so we're here today with Ellen Ketterson. Ellen is a distinguished professor of biology at Indiana University. She also obtained all of her degrees from Indiana University. She is a Guggenheim Fellow. She's a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, recipient of numerous awards, author of dozens of influential papers on hormones and life history, amongst others. Ellen, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have you.
Thanks
Thank you
for
for
being here.
the invitation.
So, the context for these interviews and what we're doing is a conversation that Jerry and I had with David Wake at an ICVM meeting a long time ago. And David was telling us about his early career and his path into biology, um, which is very, very different to the sort of experience that a lot of scientists have today. He already had a job offer before he finished his PhD, arrived at Berkeley with an NSF grant already funded, um, which just got us thinking about, how science has changed over that period of time, which prompted us to ask sorts of questions from people like you who have had long distinguished careers in science. So maybe we can start off by if you're telling us a little bit about your pathway into science and your career.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation, by the way, and the kind things that you're saying about me. As you said, I got all my degrees here at Indiana University. So undergraduate, master's, and PhD in 1974. And at first I was a botany student, uh, and then made a shift to animal behavior, really. I read Conrad Lorenz's book on aggression, had a big impression on me. Nico Tinbergen's Herring Gull's World, another book that had a big impression, made a big impression on me. So I thought, oh, well, okay, I'd like to learn more about behavior. Who here at Indiana studies behavior? And at the time, the person of choice was Val Nolan, who was first my advisor and then ultimately my husband and partner and collaborator and leader in life. But at that time, he was both a law professor and a biology professor and was studying, had been studying for a long time, life history of the prairie warbler. So he was the person on the faculty here that studied behavior. And so I asked him if he would take me on. And he was not your standard advisor in the sense that he was not trained as a biologist. He actually was trained as a lawyer, and his love of birds and love of nature led him, after he was a tenured faculty member on the faculty here, law school faculty, to want to reach out and study birds, which he'd always loved. And hence he built a program out of nothing. Okay, so there wasn't a heritage of strong biology training in his background. One of his first students was Charlie Thompson, and Charlie has studied wrens at Illinois State University for umpty-ump years, 50 plus, and very, very successful first student of Val's. And then he kind of built a program. And I at first was going to study vocalizations in prairie warblers. And oh my gosh, you guys can't imagine how heavy the equipment was. I mean, if you wanted to study vocalizations, you had to have a speaker on one shoulder and a recorder on another shoulder. And, the miniaturization of equipment would be really one of the things that's happened over the time that I've been a field biologist. Anyway, that didn't really appeal to me that much, getting up at 5 a.m. and studying prairie warblers, carrying heavy equipment. But I did learn that if I went out because I didn't quite know what to do while I was out in the field either, really. But when winter came, and the alternate suggestion was, would I like to look at dark-eyed juncos in the winter? Then every time I went out in the field and caught a bird, I had a line of data, on a data sheet. If I caught two birds, I had two lines of data, etc. And so I felt like I was building something. I was learning and accumulating data that I could interpret. And the question at the time was, where were the females? So Val had been characterizing winter populations of juncos for, I don't know, a previous, say, 15 years. And again, very personal kind of thing. Like you set the traps in your backyard and then you go off and you teach your law classes and then you walk back and you clear the traps and ban the birds and do the next step in your life. So very uninstitutionalized, I would say, learning about nature by going out and doing things. But juncos, so small sparrows, they weigh about 20 grams, gray backs and white bellies, and really very pretty. Very interesting bird for really a whole lot of reasons, not just that I love them. Um, but Nolan Val had noticed that the proportion of males that he was catching during the winter, not in the migration seasons, but during the winter, heavily skewed towards males. And so the question was, where were the females? And they might have been in another habitat, or they might have been making longer migrations, which is what we suspected and what ultimately led to my PhD thesis and a lot of work that I did in the early part of my career. So again, not so institutionalized, not a lot of oversight, no equivalent of animal care and use committee. You needed your permits, obviously, from the federal government and from the state government if you were going to be banding birds and be responsibly reporting on what you learned. But otherwise, a lot freer to decide what you were most curious about and what kind of behaviors, what kind of science could you do to satisfy that curiosity to answer a question. And so in this case, to repeat, where are the females? And hence we made field trips farther south, characterized winter populations there, did that in subsequent years, and we found the females. They were disproportionately represented in southern populations, inference being then that females were making longer migrations than males. And so I made a thesis out of why that might be. Was that because males were dominant to females? Was that because there were physiological differences between males and females? Were there sexual selection favoring early return on the part of males so that they might winter closer to the breeding range in the boreal forest if they didn't have to migrate as far? And I did that for a while and really, did enjoy it. But I think a thing that was different then than now was that there was sort of no way to know about a bird that you were dealing with in one season or the other about where it went in the opposite season. So if you were working with migratory animals, you had a snapshot. A lot of banding stations would characterize what it was like during migration. Lots of people, relatively, working on the breeding range or on breeding behavior. Relatively fewer working on populations at that time in the non-breeding season. But whether you were working as breeding birds or whether you're working with wintering birds, or particularly if you're working with migrants, you could only know about them in that period of time that you were looking at them. You couldn't track them to where they bred if you studied them in the winter or vice versa. So and I could have done different things. I could have said, okay, I think that female juncos are making longer migration than male juncos. What's happening with tree sparrows or what's happening with white-throated sparrows? And at the time, most everybody was thinking and explaining phenomena in terms of competition. So what might the competitive relationships have been between species as opposed to just what they might have been within species. But again, I was really pretty frustrated about not being able to track individuals.
Well, I want to ask you about something you mentioned earlier when you were talking about kind of how you started to ask your specific questions, and you made the comment, paraphrasing here, of course, but that you felt like you had the freedom to choose what you wanted to do. Like you could just ask whatever questions you were curious about. Do you feel like that's still true today? I mean, do they have the same freedom to ask the questions that just interest them, or do you feel like this current generation of scientists is more kind of pushed in certain directions for whatever reason? Because I would
Oh,
agree with that sentiment.
oh, yeah. I mean, all right. So if you're an academic scientist, and particularly if you're at a research institution, then you're expected to bring in money. And the whole system is depending on a certain proportion of that overhead that relates to the grants that you bring in to support your own work is facilitating, startup for the next scientist or doing more than turning on the lights, making it work as a research institution. So yeah, if you want to move up through the ranks and be able, so that's one part of it. You need to, from an institutional perspective, to be contributing as a grant winner. And then research is expensive, right? And students are what makes a research laboratory be successful. So you move past that stage where you're dependent on yourself. I'm just telling you things that are so obvious and you know them, but you build a research group and that means you have graduate students or postdocs and that means they need salaries and they need support for their work. So I don't think that you have quite the freedom that maybe once people had uh, because of the cost of your expectation, institutional expectations, because of the cost of supporting people to extend your reach and for the equipment and the supplies and the field costs or whatever. All that adds up. You need external funding, and it's harder to get.
Yeah.
Although I never thought it was easy to get. I would like you to know. But if young people think it used to be easy, it was never easy.
Fair.
You still had to turn in your proposal and get it revised because it didn't get funded the first time and try again and no guarantees, right?
Some things just never change, I suppose.
Yeah.
So, kind of to tie into that, you also mentioned how there was kind of a trend at the time in terms of how you were framing your question, that competition was really important then in terms of how you thought about what was going on there. And I've always thought that science is very trendy, especially in integrative biology. Like things kind of come along and then they go away, and then the next thing comes along. I guess have you seen that too? And do you see things being very kind of trendy and fads come and go, or
Oh,
has
yeah.
that gotten worse or about the same?
Hmm. I mean, a lot of things now I think about, and then I'm going to have a hard time coming up with examples, but be more technique driven. And so then, and I mostly didn't get money from NIH. I mostly was supported by National Science Foundation, but for a portion with the National Institutes of Health, then again, the latest technique was really just sort of essential. And if you weren't incorporating that into in my case, they would have been behavioral studies, then you weren't likely to get funded. So yes, and then a technique will kind of wear out, choosing something quite different, I would say that extra-pair fertilizations in birds was a huge endeavor. Uh, and basically what it did was get documented, and then there were a lot of hypotheses about why females might be mating with multiple males, whether they're forced upon them or were they selecting and that too led to a lot of studies and you would go to meetings and that there would be a lot of people at the sessions where the latest was being informed on extra pair fertilizations. And now it's just a thing, right? It's a thing. It adds to the variance in male reproductive success in ways that allow you to make predictions about how selection might act on male phenotypes or whatever. But it was a big deal, for a while, and it had its day, and it was extremely interesting and informative. And then we move on to other questions that became available. I mean, that too in itself was that there was now a means for genotyping offspring so that you could see that they didn't match the genotype of a whole new language you had to come up with for social fathers because fathers weren't necessarily the genetic sires, they were the caretakers, or they were the social partner of the female. But all that required a whole new vocabulary because it was a phenomenon that hadn't been known about And hence you didn't have to make a distinction about social mates versus mates that were exchanging gametes. Had to be more specific about that. So yeah, of course, competition was the explanation or the background against which a lot of arguments were being made. Ricklefs versus Weens would be important. Yep, people that were figures in that field at the time that I was a young scientist. And Weens was a skeptic about competition shaping as many phenomena as people who thought it was extremely important. I didn't stay that interested in community ecology, so my focus went more towards integrative biology, but I can remember it from my youth. Yeah, my science youth.
So you've already mentioned a couple of important things, or that have historically been important, but one thing I've noticed is that we often tend to be sort of the worst judges of our own work. And then sometimes the stuff that we think is important, like nobody cares about, and then someone might know you for something that may surprise you. Looking back at what surprised you most about how your own work was received or interpreted, if anything?
Wow, that's a hard question. I don't think I know the answer. I know I have been fortunate in the degree to which the work that I've done was recognized. And you just have to trust me when I say it was always a surprise. So, and of course, I love approval, like we all do. So I wasn't hugely grateful. I always was. Um, but I do think along the way, mostly what to do next has been driven by time in the field. Why did that animal just do that? I wonder what that means. And trying to facilitate the research of people that I was training. And so trying to come up with uh, ways to match what was going on in my research laboratory with the interests that they came with. And they almost always come with interests. I don't think that would surprise you as advisors of students, that what's already happened before you ever met them has kind of, in a sense, led them to you in the first place. But it's also their desire to differentiate themselves, benefit from a group experience, but also establish their own individual interests and accomplishments. Means that there's a tension between adding to your own ideas of what you'd like to do, taking things forward and incorporating and acknowledging and honoring, the interests of those people. So where's that headed? What you did next was a combination, I think, of things that made you curious, what you thought was fundable, being practical, as we were already referring to the importance of being funded, and facilitating the development of the people that you work with. And so often that was big surprises that their interests were so important in trying to do something next. And what kind of, in my mind here, I'm in the context of spent a lot of time at a biology station, Mountain Lake Biological Station in Virginia, here for biology stations and for that one in particular. I was at a biology station. I was doing a long-term project of um, asking what the impact of experimentally elevated testosterone would be on behavior and physiology and fitness in this bird. So the bird always stayed the same. I was talking about migration before. Now I'm talking about hormones of behavior and again, integrative biology. But turns out that I never was a big fan of the selfish gene because I guess I always thought the organism was the unit of selection and not the gene. And why did I think that the organism was the unit of selection? I think it was because this will get back to your question eventually, because I was doing this manipulation of a signal and then getting an impact on multiple tissues and therefore multiple phenotypes. And so you dial up one thing, how much testosterone is circulating through a bird's body, and then you can measure all these different impacts because immune tissues can be affected, or vocal tissues can be affected, or endocrine tissues can be affected, or muscle tissues, on and on and on. And that one signal, multiple effects convinced me that there was this real thing that we were calling hormonal pleiotropy, and that therefore the selective regime was more on the individual as a whole than it could be on any one individual trait. And why else? Because the traits are sometimes trading off against each other as well, so that hormones don't just stimulate things, they also suppress things, and hence the balance of the impact of one signal on multiple traits is complicated and calls for thinking at the level of the organism. And I think I know enough about you all and what you study that probably that resonates. Anyway, all those phenotypes, all those students, they could come in with their own individual. So one says, I'm an immunobiologist. Say, fine, how does testosterone affect immune function? And somebody says, I'm really interested in parental behavior. You go, fine. How does the hormone and testosterone affect parental behavior? And that coalescence of individuals with different interests and an organism and a hormone that'll give you multiple phenotypes um, led the way forward to what would happen next. And what would come next could be just as much the next person who entered your lab as it was what the NSF was prepared to fund. I think I closed that circle, but
Well
went
done.
off, we went off in a fair number of directions there, so forgive me if I missed it.
Um, yeah, I'm glad you brought up the manipulation studies because those were some of my favorite years, the phenotypic engineering work that you did. And I think you even coined that term, right?
I
Which
think
is
I did.
great. Um, so that had a big impact on me, of course, and my work. But I'd like to hear a little more about kind of how you got into that, because of course endocrinology is a field when it was very much mechanistic focused, did lots of experiments on mostly captive animals. But this was something that was totally different in my view. I mean, you were manipulating free living animals and looking at these massive phenotype-wide trade-offs. Maybe you can tell us how you were inspired to start those. Was it kind of those
Oh, happy
boring
to.
old studies, or was it just something
Yeah.
you came up with?
Well, definitely have to credit those who preceded me. Okay. So John Wingfield and his postdoc, Bob Hegner, were doing analogous things. So Bob was working with house sparrows and doing some testosterone manipulations to look at aggressive behavior in wintering flocks and the like. But how did I end up under the influence, happily, of John and Bob? Was that uh, studies that preceded the hormonal manipulations that we did at Mountain Lake involved parental behavior and removing males from territories so that females were raising young on their own because we took their mates away. We put them carefully in aviaries and we kept them safe over the course of the summer and we let them go at the end of the summer. So, and I can't always say that I was able to do non-manipulative or non-terminal studies, but that's been my inclination where I could. Anyway, we removed these males and we wanted to see what would happen with respect to the female's ability to compensate for not having help. And they proved to be remarkably resilient. So female juncos without help could double their feeding rate to the nest. And rear young, it got bad after they left the nest, but rear young to nest leaving as successfully as females who had mates because we hadn't taken them away. And we did this work with a graduate student at the time. His name was Leisha Wolf, and she was an excellent, excellent field biologist. But what we hadn't anticipated when we took the males away was that other males came in. So there were males courting the females whose mates had been taken away by us. And some of those males that came in helped to care for the young of their predecessor, and some did not. And so I became extremely curious about what it was that would lead to that variation in male response to offspring of a predecessor, and what might be the advantages of providing little care, and might that make you the next mate down the line if you were. But I also was interested in hormonally what was being induced in these caretaking males um, that otherwise a behavior they would not have been expressing, to my knowledge, because they had not been mated to these females. And that led me to John Wingfield. So, okay, so I read about hormones like prolactin, and I read about Wingfield's work about testosterone interfering with parental behavior in white-crowned sparrows. And so I just wrote John and said, "Can I come join your lab?" I was 40 already, so I guess I'm probably older than John. And he had an active group at Rockefeller at the time. Rockefeller before he went to UW, and Washington before he went to Davis. So and had a set of 3 or 4 postdocs all doing really interesting work. And he was generous and said, "Yeah, come." And so I got to spend a semester. Uh, and it was the very first semester that I finally had a job. So does none of this David Wake stuff for me. I got to tell you, it was 10 years after I finished my PhD before I had a job. Um, and part of that was being female at the time and wanting to have a partner and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, back to variation and hormones and male care. That was the entry into John Wingfield's world. And Bob Hegner was there at the time, and Bob was doing testosterone manipulations and in relation to mating systems as well. So there were parallel thinking there very much, where I learned from Bob while he was John's postdoc. And then we just took it back to Virginia and thought we'd do our own manipulations, and we did. Uh, and then once we knew a good deal more about how experimental manipulation of testosterone would affect phenotypes and fitness, then we wanted to know whether natural variation in testosterone would reveal similar patterns. Was it also true that naturally high males or naturally low males would vary in their phenotypes and vary in the fitness? And Joel McLaughlin, and not only Joel, but he was a very important graduate student at the time who spearheaded that work. So I don't know, what do you say? Birds stayed the same, place stayed the same, belief in long-term field studies stayed the same, but the questions with those constraints of birds and place and interests evolved as different people came along with different interests.
And kind of a convergence of some similar ideas coming together
Yeah,
with other
yeah, yeah.
folks.
Because we
It's nice
all,
when that happens.
yes, that's how it works, right? That's how it happens. Yeah.
Well, to kind of continue on with that a little bit more, I know it was sometime in the early 2000s, I want to say, when your work on female birds and manipulations of females really kind of took off,
Mhm.
um, which I thought was really cool, and it wasn't common at all at the time, and certainly prior to that. How did people respond to that? I mean, did they have a see the value of it? Did you meet resistance, or I'm kind of curious what you were met with there, because it people weren't doing that, and that was one of your big points I remember um, thinking about at the time was, yeah, we should be doing this. Why aren't people doing this?
And I would say post me, that's fostered some really phenomenal work by people like Kim Roswell and the like. Uh, but Crystal Kane was a very important graduate student when working on the females. I think in some ways just very pedestrian, right? You've looked at experimental manipulations on males. Okay, now we've looked at natural variation on males. Okay, what about females? If females were to have experimentally elevated testosterone, would that be an advantage or would it be a disadvantage? Was what was constraining male testosterone evolution possibly explicable in terms of um, female response to selection on males? So if you had selection on males favoring higher testosterone, might that also be manifested in females? And if females did not benefit, in fact, suffer from um, consequences of higher testosterone, then that could explain why testosterone levels weren't even higher in males than they were. And back up a tiny bit on that, what we had shown with experimental manipulations was that male fitness in terms of survival was compromised. But in terms of reproductive success, they actually benefited because they had more extra pair fertilizations. So there was an avenue to success via elevated testosterone, potentially. Always thinking that when you take your experimental manipulations and imagine them playing out in reality, da 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 da. Thank you. But it does seem possibly that males could benefit from higher testosterone and they actually exhibit, so might females be the explanation. So in a sense, we really still weren't looking at females for their own sake. We were, in a sense, looking at females to explain males. But once you're in that arena of being curious about females and focusing on them, then the people who followed, I guess, again, Crystal Kane and Kim Roswell and others, I fear I'm forgetting that I should, uh, saw that there really was a gap in behavioral ecology of everything explaining all the focus on males and even using females to explain males. Like, no, 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 Ellen. There's more to life.
Guess it has to start somewhere, though.
Anyway, I think that's part of the story about how we went into females. Yeah.
Very cool.
So you mentioned long-term studies just now, and obviously you worked on Juncos for a long time. Do you think that younger scientists today are rewarded for synthesis and long-term programs in the same way that it once were? Because you can imagine a situation where an NSF panel might be less inclined to give money to a young scientist working on a new system than they were to someone who's been working on a spectacular system for a long time.
Well, let's see a number of thoughts. I definitely think that long-term studies are important. And they do have to be begun or they can't become long-term. I think I've seen numerous instances of established long-term studies being handed over to the next generation. I'm thinking of song sparrows and St. Peter Arcis, and now the song sparrows on Mendardi Island. That whole operation is run by different people. So that's one way that youth can come in and take advantage of established long-term studies. And I think it is extremely important for those to be maintained and sustained. I think we've learned, love to share, but some of what we've learned because we stuck with it for a long time. I think the other thing is that young people are benefiting from the fruits of multiple long-term studies in order to be able to do comparative studies and draw generalizations. So a limitation of long-term studies is often they're in one location on one species. And so, well, how can we generalize from that, But then you take a whole series of long-term studies and begin to see patterns among them. And that often work is often being done by younger people now, I think, with the skills and the curiosity and the benefit of the fact that these things exist. And what was going on in the 60s and the early 70s to give a whole bunch of people a chance to get these started, I'm not really sure. But I do think they're important to maintain. I think there's a role for young people in them. And yes, I think that if I had NSF money and were to do it, I would say, well, let's mindfully pick out a number of species or locations where it would be a good idea. The train may have left the station for the 60s to the aughts, but the train hasn't left the station for 2026 going forward. And I think we could mindfully support the initiation of what ultimately would become long-term studies at this point. But a lot of young people are not perhaps as drawn to field studies as they are for the limitations that I just mentioned. One species, one place. Can I make a big generalization based on that?
Kind of related to that, you also mentioned earlier that your students are always doing new things. And I tell the same thing to my students. I tell them, if you do the same type of dissertation that I did back in the day, like it would, that's not really going to be good enough. You need to take advantage of the newer things that are out there. But at the same time, there's a frequent conversation that I've often had is how sort of about the decline of whole organism biology. So, do you think that something has been lost by focusing on these newer sort of techniques outside of the context of the organism? Do you think, have you seen that change? Do you think that's, or do you think it's clarified what we know?
You know, in the little subfield um, that I'm currently so interested in, I sort of made a career thing going back to migration. So I began with migration, did things that we've just been describing during this thing. And then my interest in migration, now that you can track individuals from one season to the next, is on fire again. And I do think in that subfield, it's the melding of fieldwork and technology has facilitated and opened up vast horizons. So we're learning a lot. And I think that people who are skilled in tracking, I think of a man like I've worked with recently, independent person, Alex John. So Alex John, amazing field biologist. And he's been tracking robins, but he's been tracking flamingos and he's been tracking swallows. I mean, he's just a guy that really has intense field skills and also the ability to work with modern electronics technology to learn new things. So in that particular subfield, I think that's, you talk about migration and even science, even nature, they want to know, right? Because what is this remarkable thing that animals are able to do and how do they do it? On the other hand, when you say, is there, you can't find courses in ornithology and you can't find courses in a lot of places. So the basics of learning about organisms is much more challenging now. And if that's how we had traditionally brought in young people, then they're not getting the exposure. And they're more likely to be urban than they are rural. So they're not getting the exposure. Uh, so I'm not sure about how to facilitate the future of organismal biology because, again, I think it's so fundamental and so important. But we live in this god awful change, this period of environmental change. But nevertheless, all questions are open again, too, right? Everything we thought we knew. Well, I'm sorry, the environment's changing. Maybe it doesn't work that way. So I think there's enormous opportunity for young scientists there to blend organismal biology with the response to environmental change.
Yeah, I think this will all make many, many new careers going
Yes.
forward as we try to figure out what's going on. That's for
Yeah.
certain.
And who
And
thought a
trying
reaction
to
norm that a reaction norm would like explain so much or require us to learn so much? So you can make a reaction norm. Why does it come about, right? So then you've got mechanism, you've got function, you've got selective advantage, you've got all of those things blended into explaining variable responses to variable environments that I think is still pretty wide open in many ways.
I would agree
So,
with that.
Jerry has a question about mechanisms and how important they are that I would love to hear your take on.
Sounds like one that you guys maybe have a difference of opinion about.
No, I don't think
No,
so.
it's just an interesting and it's interesting experience I had. So so of course you've done a ton with life history theory, Ellen, and um especially with mechanisms and how they kind of mediate life history strategies and at the natural variation level, but also if you manipulate things and see what happens. So I'll tell you a little story. Curious what your reaction is. So a few years back, I submitted an NSF grant proposal looking at the mechanistic basis of life history trade-offs. And this was going from genes up to morphology, physiology, and beyond. And I got this quote from a reviewer, and this is what I'm curious what you think about this. So a reviewer said in their review, knowing the details of mechanisms associated with resource allocation trade-offs does not advance evolutionary theory. Curious what you think about that.
Well, I just think that's just crazy. Selection acts on mechanisms. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you don't know how it works, you don't know how it changes, that person is mistaken. So then that's where I stand. I do think that you can learn a lot by working at various levels of organization, and that, ecosystem ecologists may not have to worry about all the things that are happening with respect to molecular interactions. But the greater the degree of integration across levels of organization, the greater the level of understanding. And that's
All
just
right.
our
That's good with me. I'm out. See you, folks.
and I'm just sure we're right about that. I really just sure we're right about that.
Well, that brings up another question related. It's probably more serious than this one, but because things have swung. We've talked about trends and kind of how technology changes questions over time, and um, how access to technology, access to field sites can kind of change what people do. So the way that people have integrated proximate and ultimate explanations has really varied a lot over the years, and certainly prior to technology, it was hard to do both well. So I guess I'm curious if you think that that's gotten better as time has gone on. Are we better at all in integrative biology at putting those two together, or are we still just, you know, too separate despite the technology? Are the questions kind of meshing well yet?
Well, I guess I think so. But, I've spent much of my career as being part of the Center for the Integrative Study of Animal Behavior here at Indiana University. And that center was founded with NSF funding and built around the four Tinbergen questions. So, development and causation and evolution and function. You can do it in a bunch of ways, but, those are the four, that's a way of referring to the four things. And at least as we were developing scientists here at CISAB, as it's called, we would be handing out funding, and the requirement of the funding was that you be able to include at least two of those four Tinbergen questions in any proposal that we were likely to be funding. But the point being that mindful, intentional articulation of multiple levels of understanding or ways of understanding or integrated levels is again, it's critical, and it can be fostered. And I think based on what it was like when those were kind of crazy ideas that we were putting together for the center, I think that we as a discipline, I think we've come a long way in doing that. And I think SICB does it especially well. I mean, you find, symposia, they're going on there on a yearly basis. You can sample and you can move up and through those various levels of integration, and they are talking with each other. So I don't think we're doomed, or I think we've made huge progress in this regard, actually. I don't know. What do you think?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, certainly the technology has helped with.
Yeah. And you're fostering it in your trainees, I suspect.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I love the mission of the center there to make them think about these different
That's right.
perspectives.
Very explicit. Very explicit. Yeah.
So you just mentioned SICB, and you were the president of the American Society of Naturalists in 2015.
hmm
So have scientific societies played a big role in your career? And do you think the importance of societies has changed over the time that you've been doing science?
I think I was so wise as to know the answers to all these questions. I can talk about them, but I've been a sampler in terms of scientific societies. So it wasn't really like I joined one and devoted myself to it and uh, had that be my only home. So I started out going to bird meetings. So the American Society of, Ornithology, AOS at the time, now AOU at the time, was one that I went to regularly. I'd go to evolution meetings. I went to hormones and behavior meetings. I go to SICB. My first meeting was uh, American Society of Zoologists that developed into uh, integrative and comparative biology. And that was like 1970 or something in Houston. So I did have an early alliances though, but you asked, do they play an important role? Yes, I think so. Do I think the only way to contribute is to pick one and go with it? I don't think so. I think that if you want to be integrative, you probably need to sample. And build some associations or people that you get to that meeting and you have somebody you can talk to because you recognize them because you've gone a couple of times, right? And so I think I wish we could afford it. So that's a
Good
real
point.
limitation. Not well, the time and the money now for young people, right? So easy to say, well, why don't you go to more than one meeting? But how are you going to be able to afford it? So that's a break on advice that I would otherwise be able to give, which is to go just don't go to just one, go to several and find your home. And that magic moment when a young person does go to their first meeting and says, wow, I belong here. These people are like me. They're interested in the same things that I'm interested in. And that's a magic moment that you want to be able to share with as many people as you can. But so
Yeah, that's one of my favorite moments is when I take undergrad students to SIGB and just their eyes and the look on their face of wow, this is just a whole bunch of really cool people that I'll never admit that I love.
I mentioned Ricklefs earlier on in that 1970 ASC meetings that Ricklefs walked by in the hallway, and I can still just remember, going like that. What an amazing person. But yeah. So yes, you see your heroes, and they mostly now they behave.
That's true. Well, so you're big name in biology, certainly in integrated biology, but you've also made a lot of big names. Um, And you've mentioned a few, Kim Rosval, of course, Joe McLaughlin, and many, many others. So what's that been like seeing, the progeny that come in fresh off the nest? Oh, couldn't resist that one. And then going off and having these really wildly successful and influential careers. What's that been like?
Oh, that's the greatest joy, of course, right? I mean, I'm going to grant what you say for the moment, and I can easily grant it about the people you're naming. Um, yes. And of course, it's not just the ones who go on to be academicians too. I mean, I can think of the student who's a genetic counselor now, or who's teaching a zillion undergrads at the University of Florida and teaching them animal behavior so that they are just, think of Nikki Gerlach here. Um, so yes, I'm very, very proud of the academic stars and all of those relationships are hugely meaningful to me. Yeah. So I would advise any young person who's trying to build a research group, I would say that a huge reward for you in this will be the relationships that you build with your students and the pride that you can take. So yeah, joy. They bring me joy.
Good advice too.
Yeah.
So related to that, one thing that I've often thought a lot about in my own career is that how, you go to graduate school and you may do some postdocs and you get trained to do science, but nobody ever teaches you how to manage people.
Yeah.
And sometimes that works out very badly in science, and sometimes
Was that
works
biographical,
okay.
autobiographical, Simon?
Uh-oh.
I'm sure my students have lots of stories they can tell you. But has there been anything that has surprised you about managing all these students, or anything that you particularly learned about how to be a good advisor to a bunch of people who are very different?
I liken it to the Red Queen hypothesis. Okay. So, you learn from one student and you think, okay, I got it. I know how to do this now. And the next student comes along and it doesn't work because the students have changed, not just temporal changes in undergraduate, characteristics, but each individual is different. So yeah, I think you have to be a constant learner and you really have to be very, very flexible. And you have to acknowledge that what you learned on the last student won't necessarily apply to the next student. You have to get to know that student. And that's the beauty of a long-term PhD. It really is, 5 or 6 year thing. So you're continuing to grow, they're continuing to grow, they're changing, you're changing. And so achieving a match is an ongoing challenge. It's a mindful task. You need to pay attention. You really do need to pay attention. And then if you do, then the rewards are huge, I think. And you don't expect to win them all. You try, right? You really try.
Can't please everybody all the time, as they say.
Yeah. And I try. So, but yes, yes, you can't. So, yeah.
So kind of related to that too, thinking about incoming students, and having had your own very successful career, having, facilitated others having very successful careers, with some exceptions apparently, but mostly.
No, not really. I wasn't thinking of anyone. I truly was. Yeah.
What advice would you give to a young scientist, kind of just starting grad school, and the whole world is in front of them? What
Hmm.
kind of advice would you give to them?
You say things like be true to yourself or do unto others as you would have others do unto you. I mean, real basic stuff, I think, because science is human interaction in addition to objective measurement and testing of hypotheses. But it's a social endeavor. And so you learn from others and you try to be a source of uh, learning, for others. So my mother was the daughter of Southern Baptist medical missionaries to China. So there's some filtering down here. I was taught to turn the other cheek. I was not taught otherwise. But I think that for me, of course, you have to be yourself. Um, Acknowledging that science is a social endeavor and building alliances and helping others and allowing others to help you is how you make advances. And then you need the technical skills as well. And learn some math, for God's sake, learn some math, don't you think?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just really important.
It really is. That's pretty solid advice, I would say. Be human. I mean, it's lost sometimes,
Yeah.
for sure. All right. Well, Fran, it's been a great pleasure chatting with you.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. It really has.